guys, I'm back with a new video today. I wanted to show some different ways to use die cuts, and I needed to make some birthday cards. So we're going to make some rainbow background birthday cards today with different types of rainbows. And I started out by die cutting an entire package of the Stamp Market cardstock. I did this with my Pinkfresh Slimline stripes set, and so these stripes are longer than the paper, which I actually like because I can use the second half and make another A2 size card. I also have got here my Misty, and I put a Sizzix sticky mat on the bottom. This is just to hold my card in place. And then I use the Misty corners, which is hard to see right there, but there's a clear ruler that's the shape of an L that I'm kind of lining everything up with. I'm also using these grid lines. And then I bring in some of my other Misty corner options and just make sure I've got that level. You always want to be very careful with that first stripe. If you get that one wrong, the whole thing is wrong. I start out using my Media Matte glue, and I have a very fine tip on it, and it just was not producing enough glue. So I switched over to my Gina K. This Gina K glue is great when you're doing things that need to move a little bit after you put them on the paper. So I like to, with my stripes, put them down and then really scoot them up next to the next stripe so that you don't have any white showing through those. You can also do this with a colored sheet of cardstock as the background to kind of minimize that, but just scooting it with the Gina K glue does a really good job. The other thing that I wanted to point out on this card is that I'm using two strips of the little bit wider stripes and then one skinny strip. One thing that I've noticed that makes a huge difference in putting these together quickly is lining up your paper up at the top in the order that you're wanting the rainbow to go. That way you can follow that, grab what you need, and always use it as a reference. When I pull this off, you'll see how much extra is on the side there, and we'll go right into what we're going to do with this. These are a few that I created. I showed you the glimmer paste that we're going to use on this stencil next. I wanted to do something different with die cutting that would give it a little bit more excitement. And I thought, I love stencils. Let's just try putting some glimmer paste over this and see what happens. This Nuvo glimmer paste is very neutral because it's in Moonstone. It's just kind of like a clear shimmer. So it still lets you see your rainbow back behind it. And it's very easy to work with. I will also say, I don't know what I do with some of my paste and that are glitter, but sometimes they just dry out so fast. And this Nuvo, I've had this thing for probably 3 years right now, and it still hasn't dried out. I don't know what I've done differently, or if it's just their packaging is better, but it really does last a long time. And even though it's a small jar, I've been using it for 3 years and still haven't run out. I also want to say that I talk about a lot of different products in these videos, and I always put links to those products in the description below the YouTube video. So if you ever need to get something or check out what I'm using, please go through that. Those also give me a little bit of an affiliate marketing incentive, so it definitely helps me run my YouTube channel and my blog. I also want to mention this mat that I'm using. It's the Waffle Flower Media Mat. It is a silicone mat, but it has a little bit of grip to it so that I didn't need to use my pixie spray or anything to hold this stencil down. I just used some pieces of Scotch tape to be safe, but I didn't put anything behind the actual piece of paper that I'm working on, and it didn't move at all. So I definitely recommend it for this kind of thing. All right, I love a good stencil reveal, so let's slowly pull this back and check it out. I'll hold it up for you and try to zoom in a little. I love the added dimension and sparkle it gives this card. And once this is dry, I start looking at how I'm going to lay it out. I love to set it down, check it out, and then make sure I lay whatever dies I'm thinking about putting on top of it out and decide which direction they're going to go. I'm going to use this Happy Birthday from Pinkfresh Studios. It's got the words in the middle and then an outline for it. I love holographic cardstock, so I had to use that today because it also just kind of enhances that glimmer with the Moonstone. For the black outline, I used Altenew's Jet Black cardstock, It's a very good paperweight, so I didn't feel like I needed to layer that. Plus, I'm going to use some foam tape whenever I put this on here. So here's what that holographic cardstock looks like on a black background. This cardstock is very thick, so you may have to punch out your little bitty details. Be careful to keep things like the dot of your eye. That, for me, was actually stuck in the die, which probably helped me keep up with it because sometimes when it comes out, you lose that little piece and it drives you crazy. So I couldn't see this great, so I decided to throw a piece of cardstock underneath it to help me just see the details. I decided this needed a fine frame around it, so I'm using Altenew's rectangle fine frames and the jet black cardstock from them. With using this die, I've used it a few times. It cuts out all of these very tiny details, tiny little frames. And if you don't secure that with some type of adhesive on the back, it tends to be very tedious to kind of put it back together. So I'm going to try out some of my new scrapbook.com double-sided tape, and I'm going to fill in that area that's going to be the back of this die, so hopefully it will stay together better. So with this, I have the double-sided tape on the back, and then I'm going to put my die up front. You want to make sure you're paying attention and thinking about that, because if you put the adhesive the other direction, you're going to end up with a mess. So the way this die works, it cuts out all of these little frames. You can separate those from each other. You can keep them together. I knew I needed to take a few of the middle ones out, and I didn't want it to go all the way to the edge. I don't want to cover up the design we worked so hard on. And so I cut these apart. It definitely makes this easier. If you have some type of little sharp tool, you can kind of pick them apart with. But also, I really feel like having the adhesive on the back tends to hold the square together a little bit better. And with all of these pieces, that really makes it a lot less complicated to deal with. So now it's time to lay this out, decide how I'm going to put it. I looked at doing it as a horizontal, but I just really like the stripes going horizontal versus vertical. So I left it this way. I did 3 frames, 2 of the larger ones and one of that teeny tiny one in between. Those frames are about, the skinny one's probably a millimeter, and the middle, the slightly bigger one is like 2 millimeters to 3 millimeters approximately, so they're little. With this adhesive on the back, you can see that I can keep them together and really do a good job at lining it up. Makes a huge difference versus trying to put some glue and keeping them together and not having the glue come through the other part. Next, we're going to figure out where we want the sentiment to be and get that arranged how we think it looks the best visually. And I'm going to pop that up on some foam tape. I used scrapbook.com's foam tape, which has a great price point, and I'm very impressed at how sticky it is. So when you have this glimmer paste on here, you need to make sure that what you're using will stick to the card. And glue would work for sure, but if you want a little dimension to that, using some really good foam tape is a good idea. So that's it for this card. You just put it on a card base, and I would be super happy to get this in the mail from a friend. So I'm going to show you a couple of little close-ups, and let's get started on that next card. So for this next one, I'm going to use part of the Stamp Market kit that came out last month, and it has this cute postage stamp with a heart in the middle. I'm going to add a little to this heart. So I'm using all Stamp Market cardstock, which is plain cardstock, and I'm going to use some pigment ink with some stripes. I just felt like that plain heart, even if it has a sentiment on it, would look kind of cool if it had a little extra there. And since we're using stripes for our background, I thought stripes on the heart might be a nice idea. So this summertime VersaFine Clair really matched the orange cardstock in the card kit. The other thing I've noticed about this ink is that it has great color to it, but it also stays wet for a little while. So we're going to try to do some embossing with it on the next slide. But when you're lining up stripes, as we said before, you want to be very precise. I always use pixie spray on this part just to make sure those little stripes stick down, and a little bit of tape just to hold the stencil. This mat is that waffle flower media mat again, and it really holds the paper behind it, so I didn't worry about putting anything sticky behind the actual orange heart, just behind the stencil to hold the stencil onto the paper. So if you're worried about staining your mat or your stencils, this is definitely not the ink for you, because I tend to have trouble. If you do it when it's wet, you can get some of it off, but I still didn't get all of it off my mat, but I'm okay with that. So I used a light hand. You can see it makes some just really fine stripes. They look really cool. Got to be careful not to touch it too much because this ink, like I said, does stay wet. So now I'm going to put it in my MISTI using that sticky mat to hold it down. And then I put my anti-static powder tool over it. And I'm going to add one of the sentiments from that stamp kit. I'm going to use Make-A-Wish because, like I said, we are making some birthday cards today. So for the embossing today, I'm going to use that Wow Clear embossing powder and VersaFine Clair Nocturne, so the black. Remember, this is that same type of ink that stays wet a little bit longer, so it's a very good one to emboss with. And their black is just great. It does a really good job. I usually stamp twice just to keep things as dark as possible, and also just to make sure it's as wet as possible before we apply that embossing powder. So now it's time to do our clear embossing over the top. I use a coffee filter per Jennifer McGuire's suggestion. This has really made a difference in how much of a mess I make with this, and also just waste in general. It's nice to be able to use that and fold it and put it right back in your embossing container. When I was doing this, I used some small tweezers. I could have picked something a little bit smaller, but these worked perfectly fine. It's great to make sure you got everything covered. You usually can kind of tell where that powder is when you're tapping it off. But once you've got it on, you just need to take a heat gun that is already heated up so that you're not going to warp your paper. This is my favorite one by Wagner. So we give it a few seconds with this heat gun, and it all just looks awesome, nice and shiny, and just one of my favorite clear embossing powders. Does a great job. So here it is up close, and you'll get to see the card up close. I really hope you liked this video, and if you did, please consider hitting the subscribe button and checking out some of my other videos. I hope to see you again soon. Thanks, bye!